Welcome to The Other Coast, a podcast dedicated to the Malifaux meta in Los Angeles. My name is Jeff, and with me here is another SoCal player, Colgan.
Hey everyone.
Hey Colgan. So sadly, Jim couldn't make it to this episode, so we will catch up with him another time. This is our chance to talk smack about him, because today we thought...
yeah.
Today we thought we might talk about what makes someone a good player, or rather a fun player to play against, how to be a kind of a positive opponent, some things we find maybe annoying about other people, in the abstract. Not going to try to shame anyone here, but just generally how to be the best opponent you can be.
Yeah, so one of the things we wanted to talk about, and I guess we wanted to preface this episode with, is that a lot of the things that we're going to mention I don't think are objectively like, this makes you a terrible person if you do these things. Mm-hmm. A lot of these things are also just going to be kind of, if you possess kind of a different mindset towards gaming than your opponent, some of these things that are seen as harmless by other people or seen as a positive thing could actually be seen as negative.
Right.
And to kind of push back on not naming and shaming, I kind of wanted to call you out, Jeff. So when I play Malifaux, like, I have a mindset where I always want to think that I'm giving my best, and I always want my opponent to be kind of like playing their best. Not necessarily that I think I'm a perfect player and don't make any mistakes, but always putting forward their best effort, or like, playing as well as they can.
Right.
And you, Jeff, have a very self-deprecating nature when you play. Like, you'll be like, oh man, I made this mistake. I'm a terrible player. If I was a good player, I would have done this. And me on the other side of the table, who's like struggling to stay in this game. For me, it's like, okay, if he thinks he's a shit player, like, where the fuck do I fall on this, like... on this like hierarchy of being not terrible at this game, when like I'm like struggling to hold on against this person who's like charging into a wall and like forgetting actions.
I mean, on my side, I feel the inefficiencies deep in my soul. So when I make a mistake, it's not, I'm not trying to say like, oh yeah, I'm beating you with one hand tied behind my back. Although, now that you bring it up, I guess I could definitely see, I can definitely see how it comes across that way. But, it's that I'm trying to hold myself to a standard of play that, I mean, may be higher than I can achieve regularly, or maybe higher than, I think that I am. But that's what I'm trying to do. And so when I fall short of that, I don't know, to me, like, calling it out helps me remember it.
Yeah, like, I mean, I don't think you're like a fucking terrible person for doing this, but it's just like, can result in a slightly negative play experience, even though, it's not anything that I think is objectively bad, right? If you're like, oh man, Colgan, you're a shit player, why the fuck are you doing this? Like, then there's like, well, Jeff's just kind of an asshole and no one will play with him because he's an ass.
Right. A lot of this is going to come down to, because gaming is fundamentally a social interaction, everything that's true about dealing with other people is true in Malifaux. And then on top of that, you have a game you're trying to play. So, the way I, kind of my upbringing was that it's I don't know, kind of blasé to compliment yourself or to speak highly against yourself. And it's kind of expected to kind of try to acknowledge your shortcomings, which I'm going to do by totally denying the entire premise of your accusation against me. But, I think what this actually does say to me is, hey, look, everyone brings some baggage to the game. And a lot of this episode, I think, is going to be talking about maybe instances where, we found an experience maybe less than ideal. But on the other side, there was probably absolutely no malicious intent.
Right. Okay, so then now that I don't just kind of come off as this naming and shaming asshole, to kind of like even it out, I'm curious, do you have any negative play experiences from playing with me?
No, I mean, I love everything about you, and just fundamentally, I'm shocked and saddened by this. It has really just demolished the foundation of what I thought was a lifelong friendship. So I'm just going to quit this podcast now and never talk to you again. And I don't know, forget Malifaux. Maybe I'll take up War Machine. No, I mean, so... Okay, I mean, I don't want this to sound offensive, even though this this terminology is not generally seen as complimentary. But you actually do not provoke much of an emotional response from me at all. Like, when I play with you, I feel like it's playing with a computer that's been programmed to be like politely friendly. um, and like what it really reminds me of is when I was a kid, my mom had this program that plays cribbage. My grandfather loved cribbage, so he taught me when I was really young. And I used to play this program, and one of the avatars was this dog, like this the kind of dogs that they have those barrels and that like would hold whiskey, and they'd go and save people from snowdrifts.
Oh, like this? Are they Saint Bernards?
Saint Bernard, yeah. Isn't that the Beethoven dog? Have you ever seen that movie?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Saint
So,
Bernards.
yeah. So I think that's what the avatar was, the Saint Bernard dog. And basically, I mean, this dog was tough. I only beat the dog about half the time. But when you are beating the dog, he's kind of he's like mournful when he's doing badly, but in a friendly way. And when he's winning, he's jovial but not arrogant. And so it's always nice to play against this dog, win or lose. And for whatever reason, when I play Malifaux with you, I'm reminded of that dog.
Okay, I feel like this is way worse than what I said about you. So I'm basically the equivalent of a digital cribbage playing dog.
You know what? It would probably be like what Data from Star Trek would be like if he played Malifaux, right? Obviously, Data's gonna beat me because he's Data.
Wait, wasn't there an episode in Star Trek where Data plays a game and then he can't win, and the only thing he can do is just like tie it?
Yeah, there is that episode, but it's a terrible. I mean, it's actually the episode itself isn't that bad, but it's from that terrible season with Dr. Pulaski, so everyone kind of forgets about it. But yes, there is an episode where he loses to the guy playing. It's not called Stratego, but in my mind, it's Stratego. Now that we know how we each really feel about the other,
I think it's time to end the podcast. Thank you all for listening. It's been a great, 10 episodes? 9 episodes?
Actually, yeah, what episode is this? I think it's 10, based on our
it should be episode 9. We were gonna, we had to, postpone one of our recordings.
Oh, that's right, because Jim has a life and can't make it every week.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, curse you, Jim.
I guess it'll be a solo show now. We can just pass it off to him.
Yeah, well, but that means he's gonna get to make this recording where we don't get to answer, and he's just gonna unload on us. Since we've both set the bar so savagely, he can say whatever he wants. Actually, yeah. Is there anything about Jim that you remember just being like, well, that kind of could have been better?
I mean, it was just kind of like, I talked about my first experience, and that's kind of what's stuck in my mind. Again, nothing he did was bad, but he's just it was. I'm trying to think of a good way to explain it. Just, it felt like there's no chill, and then but I was appreciative of that. So I much overall the experience of getting absolutely destroyed and dismantled by Jim, where he's has this counterattack and all my shit doesn't work, is a much more positive play experience than playing against you, who's oh man, I'm so terrible at this game, but I'm still kicking your sorry ass. Just that unrelenting play style I find much more comforting.
Yeah, and I mean, this is I think a good time to bring up the fact that there's no single baseline of how people respond to things, right? So your response where you would actually prefer that someone win as hard as they can, some other people are going to say, well, if they can still play reasonably but moderate a bit and we could have a game of it, that might be preferable to others.
Yeah, and I do remember that Jim had mentioned that he had received some criticisms about how he plays a little too ruthlessly in some cases, and that he should tone it back a little bit. But yeah, it all depends on who you're playing against. For me, that ends up being a very positive play experience because I'm losing, but I'm learning a lot in the process.
Right. For me personally, I there's that movie The Princess Bride, and there's a scene where Fezzik, played by Andre the Giant, is gonna wrestle the hero Wesley. Wesley's trying, but Fezzik is Andre the Giant, so what are you gonna do? And Andre the Giant is mostly just standing there, and so finally Wesley gets mad. And he's saying like, are you just playing with me? And Fezzik said, well, I want you to feel you're doing well because I hate for you to die embarrassed. and that's just how I feel, where if I can like noob stomp someone, is that likely to produce a pleasant experience for them? And this isn't a selfless behavior. It's not like, oh, I'm such a great guy. It's I want to play with this person again and again and enough times, in fact, to where they get to your state where they're beating me. And how likely am I going to get that result if I just obliterate them 8-0 here? And it turns out, if they're like you, that's what I should do. But if they're not, and so a lot of this, I think, comes into being able to read cues from other people. Gaming, like we said, is a social activity.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, because if I've had demos with people and like they're helping me along, and like whenever they do something turns out well for them and they're just like, oh man, I just got really lucky, or it's like, oh, don't feel bad, or like this and that. And again, just as far as personal things, like I think in general your approach is probably the safer one to default to.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, yeah, it's like when people are making excuses or trying to like salvage my feelings when they're beating me, it just feels very like condescending and patronizing. And it's like, just kind of accept the fact that you played better than me, and like that's how it is.
Right.
Sometimes it's very hard to divorce your ego from the game.
Mm-hmm.
I still have an emotional reaction to winning and losing. I'm not a complete digital cribbage playing robot. But, to me, like, I understand that me losing a game doesn't inherently diminish my value, or it's not a reflection of who I am as a person.
Right.
But, a lot of the times, like, especially when you first started getting in these games, and especially when I was younger, that was very much the case. Like, winning or losing was how I proved whether or not I was, like, an intelligent person, or, like, someone worthy of like playing this game or engaging in these like deep strategical war of the minds.
Right. Yeah, actually, for me, I have kind of an unhealthy view towards competition, in that, like, growing up, there was a lot of weight attached to winning. I used to play chess somewhat seriously, defense, and just at home, winning was a very valued virtue. But my response to that was to kind of, I guess drain winning of any emotional joy.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I would much rather have a game where interesting things happened and that the game itself was notable than a win. Since I've played Malifaux for a number of years now, the individual result of a game 2 years ago like doesn't really matter, right? But I know that 2 years from now, I'll still be talking about the time my corpse candle killed Hamelin. I lost that game, right? But my corpse candle killed Hamelin.
Rip Hamelin.
So, which I think brings up another point, and it's that, okay, now that we've learned that we're diametrically opposed, should we just never play each other again? And the answer is no, because we can both derive enjoyment from the exact same game, because our value system, what we want from the experience is not the same.
Right. So then I guess to kind of like maybe talk about in general, are there like general play experiences that you feel like are majority negative, and things that I guess we should be on the watch out for, maybe things you've done in the past that you now recognize are maybe some patterns you should avoid in the future if you want to kind of, like create an atmosphere, or like be able to continue like building a community or playing games, or as many games as you can with whoever's around.
Right. We're not talking about anyone specific, but I want to call it out again, because I don't, this is a podcast for our local meta. If I'm not saying our local players are glued to it, although why wouldn't they be with such gripping repartee that we have?
Yeah.
But yeah, so just to emphasize again, this is general. This is not specific to anyone. I personally find insisting on a constant and high degree of precision to be annoying. This isn't this isn't just move your model wherever you want and do whatever you want, right? But, at the same time, just having to be exact to the millimeter on everything or if there's a like a rules interpretation that's like reasonable people can differ, it's not spelled out in the rules. Maybe in the past I would have been the kind of person who wanted my opponent to acknowledge that I was logically correct, whereas now at this point I'm much more like, let's just do it whatever. Flip a card if we have to, or roll a die if we really can't resolve it. But yeah, to me, I don't want to call it rules lawyering because I don't want to give it a negative connotation. There's nothing wrong with wanting to play a precise game by the rules, but I tend to find that kind of value system to be at odds with the more laxed atmosphere that I'm looking for. What about you?
I would generally agree with that. I think that there are definitely times, the rules aren't very clear and they need to be dug into. But, whenever that happens in a game, I try to do my best to not let it stop the game.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll generally agree in whatever rule favors my opponent, because that's more likely to get the result of moving the game on. With casual games, in probably like a month, I'm not even going to remember who won or lost that game.
Mm-hmm.
And, afterwards we can have a discussion on the rules when it's not immediately relevant to the result of the game, and it's much easier to have that conversation.
Right.
I think within our meta, you're more or less considered to be kind of like the arbiter of the rules, not like in a negative sense, but if there's an argument, you're the one that spends, I feel like, the most time like reading through the rules, checking FAQs, and going online on the weird forums, and like trying to make sure you have a good understanding of any rules that are not abundantly clear with how they're written.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because like in person, you're very cordial, you're very logical, and I appreciate your explanations, and you're very kind about it. But whenever I read your posts online, it feels like you morph into a completely different person. And it's just like really funny seeing that change in like how you present and do things in person when we're at the shop, and how you introduce these rules versus when you're arguing with random internet strangers.
Yeah, I mean, I have to own that. It's true. And, part of it might, again, be the internet bubble, right? Like the keyboard tough guy. But I think the larger part of it is that, the day job, I went to law school, as a practicing litigator. I don't do litigation anymore, but I learned to write in, they call it a persuasive style. But it's actually, I mean, it's fairly insulting as a style if you read most legal briefs. Because what you're supposed to do is you lay out the facts of the case in the situation that's, or in light that's most positive to your side. Right. Then you raise your opponent's arguments just to demolish them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you raise your own, which you've actually been doing the whole time, but you just do it in a formal manner. And so because I have learned to write in that style, some of it does creep in even if I don't intend to. But also, I think I write with a higher degree of precision than maybe a lot of people expect.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the words I choose, I've chosen for a reason, right? They mean a particular thing.
Right.
And because the internet has no tone, no inflections, and, they can't see that I'm like a 5'5", little guy who can't hurt anyone. It's very easy, I think, to read it in a different tone.
Yeah, and I guess to dig into that and like kind of more in defense, like what I really appreciate when you go through the rules is that you always provide a basis for why you believe this, and you're always very open to say in certain cases where like in the end, because of this and this is my belief on how the rule should be played out. But you'll readily admit when like there is not enough material to say that this is the correct way to play this out. This is just my interpretation based on this information. And the last part where you actually make your recommendation, you will fully admit that it's a jump and you can't support that this is the way it should be played and this is how it should be played.
Yeah, that's like my actually big pet peeve in internet discussions is that I think they're very reductive, right? People just lay out a conclusion. They don't show their work. I guess my math teachers would be proud of me. People don't show their work online. They don't allow wiggle room or allow for the possibility that they could be wrong. And again, I'm speaking, generally. I'm sure many people don't do this, but a lot of internet discussions are just held at a very reflexive and, I mean, dare I say, primitive level that makes it really impossible to evaluate a lot of these claims. And I think in a stunning number of cases, people who are arguing on the internet may even actually agree with each other. They're just not articulating themselves, I guess, as clearly as they should. But that being said, when Weird release their clarifications and they end up coming on my side, like I definitely feel like I've won, which is probably not an emotionally mature response.
I remember that day when like printed in and you came to the shop, you had like the biggest fucking shit-eating grin on your face, like because like you could go back to all those forum posts and be like, this is my interpretation, and like everything you cited and everything kind of fell in line. Just, like,
Batting 1,000.
batting 1,000.
But I think some of my my forum bet noirs, some of the people I tend to be at odds with. Part of the reason why I find dealing with them a bit frustrating is I often feel like they're not even bothering to read what I write, which, because I write with an intended degree of precision, just kind of makes me feel like, well, why are we still arguing? Because you're not understanding what I'm saying. But of course, I say, why are we still arguing? I'm still going to answer this guy's next 12 posts. So
right,
why we're arguing is because apparently I'm a child in need of validation. But aside from that, what are some other what are some kind of abstracted, not personally identifying, but what are some traits of players that you find to be kind of annoying?
So there is one trait that I would think most people could agree is universally bad. If you can identify yourself in this, then I think it's probably a good idea to think about how you schedule your time.
This better not be about painting.
Say,
This better not be about painting.
I'll let you interpret that. For me, it would be punctuality, right? So if you set up a game at like 2 p.m., you show up to the shop at 2 p.m. and then your opponent isn't there, they're not responding to anything, and then like at 5 p.m. they're like, oh, sorry, I don't think I can make it. To me, that's a very negative experience, and it's definitely going to make me hesitant to try and make plans with this person in the future. If I'm going out to the hobby shop and I'm expecting a game, taking this time out of my day, if you can't make it, that's fine, just like give me a notice. But to like be unresponsive and just like completely ignore the time is, I feel, very disrespectful of the other person's time. And like you said, it's a social interaction. I don't think it's unreasonable to be upset when someone says they'll be somewhere at a certain time and then just completely ghosts you.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, this is one of those things where, because we're playing a game, on a certain emotional level, it might be like, well, it's a game. I had something else I had to take care of, and that's fine. But it's not just a game. It's an obligation you've made to another person. And so part of that is, if you can't uphold that obligation anymore, you should at least let that other person know, right? So yeah, I mean, I definitely would punctuality. And I also say, and as someone who invites people to try to demo a lot, so I'm often the initiator in these encounters. You want to make it so that people feel free to say no. But yes should mean something, right? So if they said they're going to show up, they should, or at least they should tell you that they're not going to.
Yeah, I'm not going to hold it against someone if they're like, oh no, I forgot I had to do something that, it's like I have to go to the bank or I have to run an errand. Like, I'm not going to hold it against them if they cancel it. That's something I feel like isn't unreasonable to know, like, hour or two before like the appointed meeting time. If you're just like messaging like 1 minute before, it's like, oh no, shit, I forgot I actually have to do something, I can't make it, then it's like, I'm probably already at the shop.
Right.
If you can't make it, fine, just make sure that you let the person know and give a reasonable amount of time so they can adjust their plans, right? Like, I'm not going to be annoyed if someone cancels like 2 hours before the game and it's like, okay, well, I just won't go into the shop.
Yeah, so I mean, to draw a line under I guess, bring it back to the subject, one way that you can make sure that you are a pleasant opponent to people is to show up on time and prepared to play. And if that's not possible for whatever reason, to provide as much notice as possible. And hey, look, people they're fundamentally understanding, right? So if something came up, they're going to understand. And if, and obviously, life happens and tragedy happens, and we hope we hope people don't experience those things, but they are going to happen. And so I think the more considerate you are, the more understanding other people are going to be when you need it. So here's another, I guess, a topic. Well, I guess I need these to be topics, but here's another common behavior that people have varying degrees of acceptance with. How do you feel about trash talking, Colgan?
Ooh, trash talking. I think if like both people, again, this is like a mindset thing. If people are both comfortable with it, like I think it can be a lot of fun. I would say don't do it with someone if it's your first time meeting them.
Right.
This is something I would err on the side of caution. If you're not sure how the person will respond to it, like definitely just like don't do it. But yeah, I think, games with Malifaux, especially when you're playing with someone a long time, like it definitely has its place.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think trash talking that's personal is different than, talking within the context of the game, or, something that happened in a game, right? Like, my corpse candle totally beat down Hamlin.
You're just going to ride that high forever, aren't you?
I am. I mean, that was amazing. It made it worth losing. But, when you say something like that, you're not saying, the message isn't, oh, you're so stupid and I'm so great. It's, look at this weird thing that happened that we got to experience, right? And I think a lot of trash talking that people find offensive is, of the hurtful kind that's kind of personal, like, you're so bad, your mom is so fat, like, those kinds of things that don't have any direct connection to the game. My personality is like in person, as you mentioned, it's a bit more sedate than probably, kind of like the normative American male personality. And one of the people that I play with at the store, he's more boisterous, and ordinarily I think that kind of personality would get on my nerves, but I really enjoy playing with him because everything he's talking about is relating directly to the things that are happening in the game. And so, I appreciate that.
So I guess that kind of brings up a tangential thing. As far as like personal attacks, in general, I agree with you. But like, there's some people I play with that I have a very personal relationship and we banter with each other a lot. So definitely be personal attacks. But both of us know that we're not being serious about it. Do you think that has an effect on other people in the store? If like I'm just tearing into this person and they don't actually understand that we're very friendly?
I think it could.
Okay.
But for those of you playing the drinking game, the other course drinking game, it depends. Context is everything, right? So two people who are having fun with each other, like the words almost don't matter, right? Like if you recorded their game with a camera but put it on mute, I think you can tell two people who are having fun as opposed to two people who are not having fun without the dialogue. And so then, in a way, what's being said is almost irrelevant. I mean, I don't really know if that answered your point, but I have that relationship with some people as well. So I'm not saying don't ever go personal with me, but maybe if we've just met each other for the first time, you don't have to slam the weird mole I have under my lip. So how do you deal with people and they're generally losing, and I mean, for lack of a better word, they're kind of whiny about everything that's happened?
I usually just take it with a grain of salt. When you're in the moment and, like everyone feels shitty when they flip like a black joker on something that should have been like a surefire thing. When the emotions are running strong, like I think it's very common to like kind of have those negative feelings. And, I think when you say someone's whiny, it's just that they tend to verbalize those negative emotions more, not necessarily that, everyone feels bad. It's just some people tend to verbalize it. And, like you were saying for your self-deprecating stuff, like you verbalizing it kind of helps you process it. Depending on who it is. Like for me, it comes off as being more negative because like, oh shit, I must fucking suck at this game. So I usually take it with a grain of salt. And then like, in the post game, I'll kind of talk it through. And if they seem receptive, I'll say like, in this situation, like maybe these are some things you could have done to avoid these situations in the future. And I find that most people that, you might think were like whining during the game are actually very receptive to this kind of like post game talk. And, looking back on it when they're kind of a little bit more emotionally removed from the situation, are very receptive and like understanding that, okay, it wasn't just, my luck was bad. It was that positioning here could have been better, or the strategy or the scheme that I was actually aiming for wasn't actually as attainable as I thought it was.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's probably the right approach. For me, my instinct in the moment is very much to commiserate, because I generally find expressions, especially relating to luck, right? The cards are against me, or, I can't roll a save to save my life. Things like that. I mean, you hear things like that in games, right?
Right.
They're not looking for a rational discussion, right? They're expressing frustration, and to me, the way to be respectful of that emotion is to acknowledge it. By commiserating, I feel like it's the way I can acknowledge it in a way that isn't going to be patronizing or offensive, right?
Right.
So even if I feel like I've actually had less fortune than them, because I've actually, I've had someone do this when they're winning, right? It's not necessarily tied to winning and losing. It could just be somebody's response to an unexpected or unlikely adverse effect. Yeah, I just tend to be like, oh man, yeah, I can't fight the deck.
Yeah, and I think again, it's like depending on who you're playing against, it'll change like how they want the opponent to treat them or how they expect to be treated. Because I remember, I talked in the past about how I played a lot of Underworlds. And I remember I was playing one game and like everything I rolled was like misses. I couldn't hit anything. Or if I did hit, my opponent, no matter what, managed to like dodge and not take any damage. And like after the game, he was just very apologetic. He's like, "Oh man, like I was so lucky and everything." It's like he had terrible luck, and he's like, it could have been different. It's like everything, and like to me, it was kind of like patronizing. Like I understand how dice work. I mean, like he wasn't being an ass. Like he was
Right.
very friendly. I understood. Like he was trying to like save my feelings because I imagine a lot of people who play with would get very salty and upset about it.
Right.
But like to me, it was just kind of like I understand how dice work. I understand the nature of this game. Like there's gonna be times I'm just gonna roll shit and anything I do is going to fail. And like conversely, there's going to be times where my opponent rolls terrible and everything goes against them. And I feel like to me, by invalidating your win because of like your rolls, then you're also invalidating any future victories I could have if I roll well.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's true, right? And an underlying rationale behind I lost because I did badly is you won because you were lucky, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly not very nice. In terms of your own behavior, to put you on the spot, is there anything that you do that you think in retrospect maybe people may not respond to in the way that you intended?
How I handle situations and things like that?
Yeah, or like, if some hypothetical person were to be like, oh, yeah, I like playing with Colgan, except this is the thing about Colgan. What do you think ends that sentence?
That's a good question. I think maybe one of the things could be that I'm pretty strict about adhering to rules.
Mm-hmm.
I want movements to be done according to the rules, like making sure they're properly accounting for rough terrain or like where their bases are hitting. I want the game to be played as close as reasonably possible, that is, to like how the game is intended to be played via the rules.
Mm-hmm.
I personally don't feel that I'm like overly strict about things. I'll let people take back moves, or if they're doing something that's unoptimal to what goal they're trying to achieve, I might talk them through and say, oh, you could do this instead to achieve the same result, but it's like you're not spending extra cards or you're not taking a risk.
Mm-hmm.
But I could definitely see that rubbing people in the wrong way, making it just come up like I'm always just trying to bring up all these rule things to stop them from actually winning, or like I'm trying to twist the game in my favor.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're fairly insufferable. So no,
I'm a fucking dog. Fuck off.
To the extent that it makes you feel better, I think you're definitely a charitable opponent. And the times when when you call someone on something, or like be like, I'm not really sure if you can really get there, your accuracy rate is pretty high, frustratingly. So I mean, I for what it's worth, I don't think that's really anything you have to be too concerned about.
It might be true, but still think it's a good thing to keep in mind when you're playing.
Mm-hmm.
Just things that could be possibly negative. And like, honestly, in some cases, it might just be worth it. I do want to make sure the game is played as close to the rules as possible, because I feel like that's the point of playing a game, right? You're playing within this agreed upon framework. And the further you diverge from that, the farther you're getting away from the game you're actually playing.
Right.
If I'm seen as being overly bearing, like, of course that's not something I want all the time, but I also accept in some cases, even though I'm not, or most people would think that I'm just trying to adhere to the rules, some people might have a very negative experience with that. And I guess in that case, like, I'm not going to completely change how I handle that just to try and cater to like the very small amount of people that might think I'm going too far.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you can't make everyone happy all the time. And I think, the term rules lawyer gets thrown around, I think, much too cavalierly. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, a rules lawyer is someone who will adopt an overly technical analysis to everything. And so there's no context in terms of importance, right? And so part of what makes playing with them exhausting is that it takes forever to do everything. Because when I play casual Malifaux, maybe all the movements aren't exact to the millimeter, right?
Right.
But the time that you save and the hassle and kind of the emotional drain and the mental drain, because Malifaux is not an easy game to play, in my opinion, more than makes up for it.
Yeah, then I guess turning the question back around to you, are there personality or aspects of how you play that you think would contribute to a negative experience for your opponent?
Well, I mean, obviously there are. It's hard, I think, to necessarily understand what's annoying about oneself. So, maybe I don't really appreciate it very well. One thing, I have a personality trait where I interrupt people. I've kind of done it all my life, but really it came up when I was, practicing criminal defense attorney, because I need to know what I need to know in the order that I need to know it. And then all this extraneous stuff about anything else that's going wrong in your life, I am genuinely sorry about it. But we have to be in front of the judge in like 2 minutes. So let's just try to get through this conversation. So that is a personal bad habit that I have, and I try to work on it. But ultimately, what I'm going to say is just much more important than what anyone else is going to say anyways. So the conversation is just net gaining when I interrupt people. Other than that, so there is a very particular thing with demos, which I thought was being helpful, but I was doing a demo for someone a friend of one of our local players, and I was trying to explain, he was trying to figure out how to do something. I was trying to explain how he could do it, and he was kind of talking his process out, and I was saying, well, you could do this, and he said, well, actually, could you not tell me, because I prefer to work it through on my own, which obviously is entirely legitimate, but I personally failed to kind of understand his process, and I might have been kind of too guiding, which is something demos actually can fall victim to. And then I guess kind of maybe a final thing, which I don't do all the time, but maybe, and maybe not so much in Malifaux, but in other games, I don't always maybe provide the play experience that someone else wants. And what I'm thinking of in particular is Magic. So I like Magic in a very particular way. I don't like any of the constructed formats of Magic, because it's too efficient. It produces a game that I can admire, I guess, mathematically, but I don't like the kind of play in like Standard or Legacy or any of those like highly tuned settings. I like draft, and I like to draft 5 colors. And sometimes my decks work, sometimes they don't. But if I'm playing someone and my deck doesn't work, because I didn't draw the right color or whatever, which these things are going to happen from time to time in draft in 5 colors, the person, even if they beat me, they didn't get to play a game of Magic. They played their stuff. I just sat there tried to draw a swamp, right? And I didn't, so I never played anything. I'm not saying I would have won with a swamp. I'm saying I actually didn't provide a Magic experience at all. And I guess to bring it to Malifaux, there are times when I will just play a list that I want to play. And it's not a joke list. It's not that, I picked these 5 teams because they all resemble members of the A team. And so I'm just trying to like do some sort of kitsch 80s thing. The list will make sense, but it might not be, the kind of list that's going to deliver sort of a, quote unquote Malifaux game experience to someone. I'm sure when our other local players hear this, they can fill in the blanks for us what we do.
When you said like non-Malifaux experience, all I could think about was running Yoko with Sama.
Okay, I have a defense to I have a defense to that, but we won't get into that. But actually,
my defense is I wanted to do it.
I mean, so that is the thing, right? I wouldn't say emotionally invested, but Malifaux is one of my larger spare time investments. And so part of that is just thinking about these various lists that I would like to make. And because I get to think about far more lists than I ever get to play, it sometimes means that unfortunate things hit the table in unfortunate times.
You just sound like it's some kind of random act of God. It's like, I'm sorry that you had to come up against this list.
It's a Jeffacane. No one can predict. No one can predict the Jeffquake. Okay, so aside from kind of like these personal pet peeves, which are, I guess, maybe kind of inherent to someone, there's also at the board, right? Maybe not necessarily so connected to a person, like these negative play experiences. And like we kind of touched on one where like a game is just so precise that playing it takes forever and is mentally draining. I think a lot of people would describe that as a negative play experience. For me, another like kind of negative play experience is just seeing proxy models everywhere. Like, in my opinion, if
Mm-hmm.
someone wants to try a model before buying it, I mean, that's fine. And if they want to try a couple of models, that's fine. I don't mind a proxy or two in a casual game. But I don't want to be playing with someone who is taking Hinomatsu for the fourth time and they're still, representing them with an empty 40 mil base that says, Hinomatsu written on it.
I guess in that case, does the quality of the proxy matter to you at all? So if like they have a like puppet like thing from another game and they're using it as Hinamatsu, will that like extend the amount of time you're okay with them using it as a proxy, or is it after like 4 or 5 games? Just get the Hinamatsu model so I don't have to keep in like filling in the gaps.
I mean, there is a clear distinction, I think, between a conversion and a proxy, right? If someone has made like, a
Mm-hmm.
badass model that they want to be Hinumatsu, I'm all for that. If it's just that, oh, I bought this like pre-primed D&D miniatures and I just glued it onto a 40 mil base and that's my Hinumatsu, maybe it sounds silly to talk about immersion in a miniature war game because it's not generally thought of as an immersive experience, but at the same time, I am playing Malifaux. I'm not playing checkers, right? These models, they have names, they have backstories, and there's a setting, and that's part of what brings me to the game.
I mean, I would kind of disagree that immersion isn't part of the experience because I mean, the most common thing that people advise when you're first starting the game is the rule of cool. Like, you go for the model lines or the stuff that you think look great. So, I mean, obviously, a lot of people feel like the look or the style of these miniatures does play a big part in the game,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or else, like, everyone would be fine. Like, all right, let's just get some bases, like, write a name on it and play the game because from a technical level, there's absolutely no difference. I don't have like an advantage because I have a Hinu Matsu model over your 40
Right.
millimeter base.
Yeah. No, I mean that's true. What's like another negative play experience that that you might have in mind?
I guess this might not be directly tied to the game, but I would think that hygiene could definitely result in a negative play experience. I guess this falls more under kind of like the social realm of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because these games are going to be like anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, depending on how comfortable or you are with the game.
Mm-hmm.
And if the person that you're playing with is very like unkempt, obviously haven't taken any effort to kind of maintain a certain level of personal hygiene, it can be an unpleasant experience playing with them.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what I would say is just make sure that before you stop at the store, take a shower, maybe just make sure your clothes are kind of clean or at least not effusing some kind of unpleasant odor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And try and keep these things in mind. It's like you are going out in public, you are interacting with other people, and if you do, I guess, want to keep making sure that you're getting in these games, you want to give as few reasons as possible for people not to want to play with you
Right.
again.
Yeah, and I mean this is a really awkward subject to broach, because it is so intensely personal, right? But I think ultimately we're all going to share this space together. We all want it to be as pleasant as possible, and so that means we all have to do our parts, right? And I think part of what makes talking about this difficult is that oftentimes like someone who maybe struggles with a hygiene practice, it's easy, I think, to think bad things about them, like, oh, they're unclean or whatever. When the reality is there are numerous medical conditions that can produce effects that other people find unpleasant to be around, right? And those aren't necessarily, no one's to blame for a medical condition.
Right.
And again, I'm just gonna call myself out here. I have damaged teeth from my orthodontics. I have damaged teeth and gums from when I was a kid. Really fucked up my teeth and gums, and so I have lifelong damage. And as a result, my gums they're more susceptible to like infection and stuff like that. And so I understand that I am at a greater risk of not having a pleasant breath. And if I'm doing demos, I'm going to be talking to people kind of closely, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so because I understand this about myself, it's something that I try to take extra steps to fix. But also it may not, there's probably times when it's not possible to fix. And so it's just something I think you have to understand about yourself and just be mindful of the other people who are in your space.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. On that note, since we've kind of covered, I think, a few of what we think are negative play experiences, and considering you're kind of the organizer of our local meta, do you have any, I guess, advice or techniques that you use when approaching certain problem players and maybe discussing their behavior? Or is that something you even broach? Is it something you kind of skirt around? Or I guess how do you try and deal with these issues once you view that they're a problem?
So everyone grab your shot glasses because it depends. If it's something minor, I just endure it. Thomas Jefferson said that experience has proven that men will bear ills while they're bearable, right? So, I come here to play games. If there's something about someone that I just find, a little off-putting, I just endure it. And I don't see the net gain from confronting it to be high enough for myself or the group. If it's something major and if it's major and it's correctable, that is something that I've had to deal with before in the context of role-playing games, not ever in miniatures games, but I've run a number of role-playing games over the years, and sometimes you get these personality conflicts in the group, and if it's between particular people, I have to find it's best to address it head-on outside the game environment. Just be like, player A and player B, like I've noticed like this is going on, and this is kind of how I felt, and I think it's providing, it's provoking this kind of response, so let's kind of talk about it. Whereas if it's just like one person's at fault, like there's only one input,
Right.
then I will address it if I think it's something correctable. If it's something like the person's horrible, like anything racial, no, I don't have time for this, right? Like I've played a game with 40K many years ago with someone who then just in passing after the game used a slur about Arabs, and I've never played with that person again, right? So for me there are hard lines, but they're pretty distant, and I'm willing to, like, if you think about this as a spectrum, I'm willing to endure like 80%, and I'm willing to address 97%, and then 3% it's just like, okay, like you can go fuck off.
Right.
And sometimes it's even things that I don't think, sometimes I have to moderate my behaviors that I don't think are a problem. Like I've played games with someone who was like very religious. And so words that, okay, obviously, fuck is fuck, right? But, like words like, oh, I got screwed, like that would bother this person.
Oh, okay.
And because they were otherwise, a pleasant person, and because I could make this change to my own behavior and preserve an otherwise fun interaction, I just went ahead and did it. So sometimes even if I don't think I'm quote unquote at fault, if I can resolve it through my own actions, I'm more likely to do that than to try to fix someone else.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, but now that we're on the subject, I have been meaning to talk to you about your rules lawyering. Do you have some time?
Which rule do you want to fight about, huh? Do you want to do this on the forums?
I have to do it on the forums. I can't argue with you here. Okay, but enough about bad things, because we've spent a lot of time ragging on people, which again we want to emphasize. When we say we're not talking about anyone in particular, that's not a cop out. We're not really talking about you, but not talking about you. We're trying to identify traits kind of in the abstract. So what are some like positive steps you think someone can take to be a good opponent?
So I guess the easy answer would be to say, kind of do the opposite of the negative behaviors we put out. Always try to be on time. If you can't make it to something, make sure to let your opponent know well ahead of time so they can change their plans accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I think is good is to be, in casual games especially, to be charitable to your opponent. I know we've discussed in the past, like, how do you handle things if someone, forgets to stone for a suit before they flip a card for something that they most likely would have used that stone for. Like, for instance, if they're summoning a unit and they don't have the right card or suit in hand, but they have enough stones, I mean, most people would have stoned for that. And if they forget to do it, I don't think it's like, a huge issue to say like, okay, you can go ahead and just burn the stone and add that suit now, since, that was obviously your intention.
Right. Yeah. And like, things like declaring triggers, right? Oh, like they forgot to declare a trigger. Should definitely let them do that. But that sounds kind of obvious and trivial, but the reason I bring it up is I was playing a game, I forget who my opponent was, but they had one of the riders with their damage reduction triggers.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't understand the rules well enough, so they thought that they could spend the fate tokens to declare how many rams they needed after the flips, when they saw the damage, rather than you know when
During the reaction trigger.
exactly. And so in that case, I was like, yeah, well, that's fine. Go ahead and spend the fate tokens to declare the trigger. And like we said, a lot of this is about context, right? This is if you have the sense that the mistake was genuine, I agree. I pretty much always let people. In fact, I mean, to be honest, I can't think of a time when I've said someone couldn't take something back in a casual game, and people haven't really asked in a competitive game. But yeah, the more charity you show, the more charity you're likely to get, right? If not in a specific instance, at least over the long run.
Yeah, and something I think it also contributes to is something, a phrase I've heard thrown around a little bit, is kind of the learning mentality versus, I guess, the winning mentality.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, casual games are a way to improve your play and to try and learn more about the game.
Mm-hmm.
And if if you want to go to the competitive level, that's when you're actually putting all of this into practice.
Right.
So until then, it's like, generally you want to be charitable and you want to kind of create this environment where people feel free to experiment, or, they don't feel like missing the timing on a specific thing is going to result in them losing. And I think that's also where you get into the idea of rules lowering having a very negative connotation, or that's when it's generally used. Like
Mm-hmm.
in the case of the rider, I think it's very understandable to not think that you need to declare the damage reduction before the damage is flipped, because any other time you do damage reduction, it's either automatic or it happens after you know how much damage you've taken.
Right.
Right? It's like the riders, I think, are very unique in the fact that you declare it after you've lost the duel, but before any damage has actually been flipped for.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's a very understandable mistake. And, someone who doesn't run riders all the time, like, it's going to happen on a fairly regular basis because the timing is not obvious.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's a good way to put it that sort of describes the entire phenomenon. One way I think people can be good opponents is to kind of handle corner cases the same way, no matter who would benefit, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these corner cases, oftentimes, any of the resolutions are kind of valid. It's just, you should be using the same one every time. So one example I think of is what to do when too many cards are flipped. This is actually not uncommon, right? To just accidentally flip too many cards, or to have been like, oh yeah, I thought I was focused, but I forgot I wasn't, or whatever. It's we're flipping cards, so it's gonna happen that you might flip too many. My expectation is that people should actually reshuffle their entire deck, right? You should put that card back on and reshuffle it. But other people have other ways to resolve it. Some just put them right back on top in the order that they would have come in. Some other people have maybe a different resolution. To me, the resolution, the actual way that you handle it doesn't matter. I just think it should be handled the same way every time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As long as you're keeping it consistent and it's not like for your opponents, like, oh, you have to reshuffle your deck. But for me, I'm just going to put them back on top of my deck just so I kind of know what's coming.
Right.
Right. It's like giving yourself an unfair advantage. And I think that's one of the things that I think people will react to, right? If you're charitable, or at least you're very consistent in how you handle situations, then even if it might produce like a slightly negative reaction in the person, they're not going to have an overall negative opinion of you because they understand that this is how you resolve these situations and that you're being consistent in how you act.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, if you're only bringing up these like edge case rules when it's going to benefit you, but then when it doesn't benefit you, you're all hush, people are going to react to that as well. Like, even if you're resolving these rules correctly, if you're being unnecessarily harsh or like critical of your opponent and very lax on yourself, then people are going to have a very negative opinion of you instead of, just like chalking it off to like, oh, maybe you forgot it. So I guess this idea of having consistency in your actions and people react to that. And over time, generally people will be more willing to play with you, even if they might have slightly negative feelings about certain things you do.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think a lot of this just, again, comes down to you want to foster an environment where people feel that the deck isn't rigged, right? To use an expression which is particularly apropos to Malifaux. So something else that I think people can do to be good opponents is to learn the rules, right? To take a proactive effort to learn the rules. I understand it. You do a demo and you play a couple games, you're learning, In fact, everyone is always learning. It's been said on other podcasts, and I totally agree that there's no such thing as a game of Malifaux that's been played 100% correctly. So I'm not saying that only new players need to worry about this. But especially if you are a newer player and you feel like you're not as solid on the rules as you could be, I actually find it an issue of consideration. It's about preparation. I think if you come to the game having made an effort to learn the rules, that is more considerate than just having a demo and then just relying on your opponent to just always understand the finer points of the game.
Yeah, I would agree. I would also just want to add in something that if you're not sure about the rule, I think as long as you ask before you take the action, people also react a lot more favorably to that.
Right. Well, and the thing is too, nobody, or okay, I can't actually say that, but virtually nobody wants to win the game because their opponent didn't understand a rule, right? Because that just, it's not fun. It doesn't feel good for either player. And this actually, I think, goes back to maybe one of the things we were talking about in terms of player improvement. Asking questions, it's not a sign of weakness. It's not a burden on your opponent. There's nothing negative about asking a clarifying question. So I guess to maybe pull away from the individual level, look at this from the point of view of organizers. How do you feel? Suppose you're Malifaux night or Malifaux day, and the players are in. How important do you think it is to like proactively arrange matches of appropriate skill?
I feel like if there's like a newer player who's only played like one game, it can be very beneficial to like pair them up against with a more experienced player to kind of like help them out a bit more and like go through the rules. Obviously, you want to pick someone who, is willing to go through that. If someone's there for like they're prepping for a tournament or they want a more serious game, then they're probably not the best person to match up with. I guess this still kind of goes back to knowing your players, knowing their mindsets. I don't think it's of utmost importance that you're trying to make games as close as possible. I think the thing that I would look out for more is making sure that the people that are playing are kind of compatible in, I guess, their goals for the game or what they're trying to accomplish.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that last point is spot on, right? I mean, that's really what you're looking for. And if two people just are not really going to get on, it's kind of, I mean, almost pointless to pair them up against each other if it can be avoided, right? So maybe another thing I think organizers might think about in terms of like trying to be a pleasant organizer is trying to, I mean, pressure is kind of an unhappy word, but encourage people to play games. Especially if your meta's been going for a while and if you haven't been able to add a bunch of consistent new people, it might become a bit stale and people might lose interest. And as an organizer, you might actually come to see that as sort of a personal failing, like you haven't done enough, or a personal shortcoming, like, oh, well, they just don't think, what you're providing or what you're trying to provide is fun enough. But what are some steps that you think people can take to kind of encourage games in a healthy way, and what do you think organizers should do in response to these lulls that maybe would be healthier than badgering people into games?
I think one of the biggest things is something we've mentioned before is just setting a consistent day to play. You go in on Tuesday, you can get in a game of Malifaux is very different from having to like actively like plan out your schedule, call out to someone else in the group, set up a time and like a specific day to play against them. The more hurdles you can remove to getting in a game, the more games you're going to have, right? I think some other things that you can do and encourages, you can have like monthly events. Sometimes a tournament can be good, or maybe just having like a little mini league where it's like, okay, whoever gets like the most minion kills or whoever plays the most unique opponents this month, will get like a free box or this free little trinket or doodad, some kind of end goal for people to work towards. And I think sometimes you might just have to accept that there's going to be lulls. Like a lot of miniature game players play more than one game.
Right.
I guess in our local meta, 9th edition of 40k just came out. There's a lot of people that normally play Malifaux, but now that there's all this hype behind playing 40k, and they want to try, get in some time, build the new models, paint a new army, and play with the new rules. And that's going to necessarily take away time they have for other games like Malifaux. And sometimes, I think you just kind of have to ride it out. You should be available for games, try to keep those consistent game days, but just understand that not everyone is going to play Malifaux all the time.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I agree entirely. And I think if you've organized a meta, and if your meta has managed to be, reasonably successful, right? And by which I mean, there are consistently games and, you've grown to a decent size, it can be almost inevitable that you get some ego investment in the community, right? And so, in a sense, I think it can be kind of natural, not that they intend this in any sense, but I think it can be natural to feel like a sense of rejection when the people who used to come and play your game, you now see at the store, but they're playing something else, right? But I think just you have to understand it. It's not personal. It's just people are playing what they're playing, and that ultimately these lulls are probably healthy for the community, right? Because it gives people a chance to recharge, especially for a game like Malifaux. I'm not knocking 40k. 40k, I can have fun playing 40k. But I don't play 40k to think, right? That's not my experience there. But the side effect of that is that playing 40k is far less mentally demanding than playing Malifaux. So, I get something very different out of it. It's a very, it's an easy kind of fun. And so, after people have played that for a while, they might come back to Malifaux with recharged batteries.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to try and, not attach yourself too personally to anything. And, there's just going to be some people that don't like Malifaux for whatever reason. They maybe get a crew, play a couple of games, and they're just like, this really isn't the game for me. But I remember at the shop, it's like we were discussing Malifaux, and then before someone voiced their concerns, they turned to me. It's like, I just want to apologize in advance, Colgan. And I was like, what? Do I work for Weird now?
Is my name on the cover?
It's like, I mean, if you don't want to play Malifaux, it's like you don't have to apologize for yourself.
Right.
I don't feel like not liking a certain miniatures game is something you need to write a thesis on and support with a number of arguments to try and explain to the weird overlords why you don't want to play their game.
You can't fight against preferences, right? Yeah. So I just thought about this because of your anecdote. Does that experience change the way you think you're seen at the store? Do you think you're connected to Malifaux? Yeah, that's how they think of you in the store.
I think so. I guess it's really hard to answer a question about how you're perceived by other people, but I do think people tie me pretty strongly for Malifaux since most of the days I'm in the store, I'm there for the Malifaux game days and I'm playing Malifaux. But I mean, one of the things that I actually enjoy about playing Malifaux, or I think a fringe benefit, is that it's actually made it easier to get into games like 40k again. So if 40k was actually the only miniatures game, I think I probably would have stopped playing miniatures games, just because I like kind of the tactical depth that you can go into Malifaux, and I feel like how much control you have over the result of the game, and how much room there is for improvement from game to game. But like you said, it's very mentally taxing. I don't want to play Malifaux all the time. It can be a very draining game. So it's nice to have a game like 40k where it's all right, I'll just move close and I'll roll a bunch of dice and I'll try and shoot you off the board. And I'm not going to worry about oh, do I get the right suit? Do I have the correct amount of resources dedicated to this? Am I actually maximizing my units? It's okay, my guys have guns. They need to be in range to shoot those guns. Maximum efficiency.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this because seeing it traumatized me. But I was watching a game of 40k, a while back, and one of the players, a Tau player, had deployed his entire army in a little square, in a little box, kind of like an old English square that's used to repulse cavalry, way back in Victorian times or whatever, in just one corner of the board, and that was all of his models. Except for one little dude who flew around, and I think he died pretty early. I don't even know if he had a real purpose other than just something to mess around with. And other than that, the guy's army just sat in the corner and shot everything from it. And I was like, that's a game. But thinking back, yeah, that's a game, and that you can play. and you can have fun, and you can roll a bunch of dice, and you can put models on the board and take them off, and you're not really having to try to beautiful mind everything the way you have to agonize over some of these Malifaux decisions. So, yeah, I guess I see the appeal since I'm joining the Slow Grow 40K League at the store.
Oh, you actually started painting one of your models. Unprecedented.
I've repainted the base coat 3 times because I didn't like how the highlights turned out. But I'm liking how the highlights are turning out in this case. So we'll see. I'll bring the figure by next Malifaux day.
Display it along inside your shed.
Inside my shed.
The Jeff 2020 collection.
So I guess maybe the last thing I want to hit on, which maybe is a bit tangential, but I just kind of thought about it, and so I'd like to talk about it in terms of how it impacts the community. What do you think about tracking stats? Because, we have just a great member of our local meta who took something that we were doing for just a monthly event, that once the event ended, we just kind of kept tracking out of habit, but we didn't have any plans for it. And then a new player joined us who knows how to take this data and make it look super cool and just derive a lot of useful statistics from it. But what do you think are the upsides of that? What do you think are maybe any potential downsides? What do you think about tracking stats?
Yeah, interestingly enough, or I guess maybe this was your intention, but we did have this discussion in our meta once we realized it was possible to kind of like take all this data and pull meaningful information from it. So I think by and far, everyone was in favor of continuing to track this kind of information just because we were interested to see what kind of data we could pull from it and if any of it would be useful. But one of the big points of contention was whether or not we should track individual player results and data for these casual games. Like at a personal level, I guess I was kind of on both sides. Like I didn't mind tracking that information and my information being public. Like at a personal level, I didn't mind. But for the community level, I kind of saw it as a negative because I didn't want people's casual play experiences to be influenced by the idea that the wins and losses are going to be tracked, because I knew that's going to have an effect on your playstyle. Like you might not have people being as adventurous or trying as many weird things if they're like, oh no, now I'm just going to have like all these losses on my records and then everyone's going to view me as a terrible player, and that's just going to be like enshrined in this like little data collection spreadsheet we have for all time. And like I didn't like the idea of that affecting people's playstyles for what really should be just like a casual afternoon of Malifaux.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. And I think, kind of the compromise that the community eventually hit upon was that, we wouldn't display those individual statistics. If someone really wants to go through the Excel sheet and do the math, they could do it. But, otherwise, kind of the game data, right? Like the masters that were played, the schemes and the strats and things like that. I'm glad we have that data available. It's interesting, it's fun. It's also proven to be useful in another way in that, we recently had a player join us who maybe didn't choose what master to play based on what they saw, but they were able to narrow the options because they wanted to play a master that wasn't getting played out all the time. And so they were able to see like, oh, okay, these masters see more games than others, so I'm going to choose from kind of the more scarce masters.
Yeah, like it's one of those things. I think having the information available is nice. And honestly, on my mind, like worst comes to worst, if we decide it's an evil source and must be destroyed, like we can do that pretty easily.
Right. Which, again, I brought this up maybe even twice now, but I just want to draw a line under it because on one level, it's like, okay, what do your stats matter in casual Malifaux in Los Angeles, right? In an existential sense, what does it matter? They're not important. In 50 years, everyone at the store is going to be dead. In 5 billion years, the sun's gonna grow to a red dwarf or a red giant, I forget which one, and then consume the earth, right? Like in a very real sense, your stats shouldn't matter. And so if we were all purely rational beings, it'd be like, oh, okay, I mean, who cares if people see my win and losses? But the reality is, as people, what we spend our time in matters, right? And we draw varying degrees of like emotional rewards from what we do. It's entirely okay to like the way you feel from playing Malifaux. Like if you're good at Malifaux, I mean, obviously, don't be a dick about it, but there's nothing wrong with actually feeling like, oh, well, I mean, I'm a good player. I've put in some work, and you derive a little bit of enjoyment from getting to practice that skill. There's nothing wrong with that. If you've made a community, you established a meta, and you've done it week in, week out, and now it's grown to 10 people, which is pretty good for a weekly game thing. And some people maybe say good things about how you organized. It's okay to feel a sense of accomplishment from that. But just understand that at the same time, those emotional responses, the kind of the value you have in the game and the extent that you care about the game or whatever, those are your Achilles heels that might also, I guess, generate what other people find to be negative play, potential negative play experiences, right? So if you care about your record a lot and you're competitive, now you don't think you're a dick, you're just playing to win, but maybe you came across to another person as just being kind of overly competitive or like that win at all costs guy. And so, a lot of this is just about recognizing that gaming is a social activity. You're interacting with other people. And so just a little bit of empathy and self-awareness goes a long way, right?
Yeah. And, like a soap and a watch.
Also always handy. All right. Well, that was an hour and a half of us throwing shade at whole segments of the population. We know it wasn't necessarily directly related to Malifaux, but we think, these are relevant, I think, to gaming in general. And if you wanted to elevate it to a higher level to where it's not really all that appropriate, all of human interaction. So that's what you get from our channel, just the globally relevant. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like, a share, or a subscribe. We would love to hear from you. We play here in Los Angeles, but we would like to be part of the local Malifaux community. The wider Malifaux community, rather. We're already part of the local community. So we would love to hear from other people and other players in other regions what they think. And if you'd like to support the channel in other ways, we have a PayPal and a Patreon. The links are going to be in the show notes. So that would also be super cool. And other than that, that's all from me. Is that all from you, Colgan?
Yep, nothing more to add. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Yep, thank you. Good night.